It seems that the Targum Onkelos that we have before us was given a gushpanka, was given a seal of approval, a haskama, by the greatest hachamim of that time, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. It became the standard Targum, not the only Targum, but the most authoritative Targum. In Bavel, it became essentially the only Targum. In Eretz Yisrael, we know there were other Targumim as well. There is the Targum Arami of the Torah, which is attributed to Yonathan ben Uziel, but is certainly not from Yonathan ben Uziel. That's another discussion. But there were other Targumim. There's something called the Targum Yerushalmi also, which is similar to the Targum Yonathan, what's miyuchas, what's attributed incorrectly to Yonathan ben Uziel. In other words, these are Targumim of the Torah from the Amoraic period. In other words, we're talking about the 3rd and the 4th centuries, Leminyanam. In Eretz Yisrael, they were also widely used, but none of these received the same kind of haskama, the seal of approval, as the Targum of Onkelos. And even in the academic world, the Targum Onkelos is considered to be very ancient. That it was probably originally, in other words, the various academicians who have looked into this also conclude that it is very ancient. Some of them talk about the 2nd century, but even that doesn't. I don't think that in any way really contradicts anything that we've seen here, because as we said, the Targum of Onkelos, it says in the Talmud Bavli Megillah Daf Gimel, Amaro, not Ketavo, Amaro. He composed it, and it was studied and learned Ba'al Peh, just like the Mishnah was learned Ba'al Peh. But the Mishnah also was not written at that time, was not committed to writing. It was only from the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi onwards, in other words, approximately 100 or so years later, a bit more even, 130 years later, that the Torah Ba'al Peh, the oral traditions were slowly and reluctantly committed to writing. So the Mishnah, and one can assume, I do assume that at this time the Targum of Onkelos was also committed to writing, and in Eretz Yisrael, and then it made its way to Bavel, and there it also underwent certain redactions and perhaps changes of style to take into account the fact that there are differences between the Aramaic of Eretz Yisrael and the Aramaic of Bavel, Eastern Aramaic as opposed to Western Aramaic dialect. But the backbone and the essential methodology of the Targum Onkelos, I think we can certainly accept and should accept, exactly as it is stated in both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, that this was already known and placed before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, before the Hurban, and they praised it very highly and gave it their seal of approval. And then it began to be disseminated and began to become more and more common and was studied and recited Ba'al Peh Mamash. And then later was committed to writing. Later, as we said, just as the Mishnah was committed to writing. In other words, those things that had been Ba'al Peh became eventually Bichtav, not because it should be that way, not because it's ideal that it be that way, but as Rashi says in Masechet Bava Masiah, that at the end of Perek, at the end of Elu Masiot, Rashi says that the Mishnah and the Talmud and all these things were not committed to writing, and only in our time, Rashi says. In other words, Bedorofenu, Rashi says, Bedorofenu, in recent generations, the Talmud was was committed to writing. The Mishnah was committed to writing earlier, but the discussions on the Mishnah were not yet committed to writing. So says Rashi in the Vamasiyah. In other words, there was this evolutionary process of things being entirely Baal Peh. Eventually, some things were committed to writing because of the very real hashash that things would be forgotten. They probably saw that more and more mistakes were creeping into the text, and this process had to be arrested. And later, other texts like the Talmud also eventually were no longer committed only to memory, but also to writing.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.